the Oscar for the Best Picture of 1992 goes to
And the Oscar goes to
Clint Eastwood.
Clint Eastwood for Unforgettable.
For more than 5 decades, Clint Eastwood stood as one of Hollywood's most enduring legends. The quiet gunslinger, the fearless detective, the man whose steely gaze seemed to say everything without speaking a word. But behind the iconic roles and the applause of millions, there was always a quieter question people wondered about. Eastwood had known many relationships, marriages, affairs, companions who shared parts of his long and complicated life. Yet, through all the years, he rarely spoke openly about love. Not the kind that fills gossip columns, the kind that stays with you. Now, at 95, looking back across decades of fame and memory, Clint Eastwood has begun reflecting on something far more personal. One woman, the one he never truly forgot. And the story of that love begins long before Hollywood ever knew his name. The first woman who believed in him, Maggie Johnson. Long before the fame, the awards, and the legendary roles that would define his career, Clint Eastwood was simply another young man trying to survive in Hollywood. In the early 1950s, success was far from guaranteed. Eastwood took small acting jobs, auditions that often went nowhere, and occasional work just to make ends meet. The future that millions of fans would later admire was still uncertain. But during those difficult years, someone quietly stood beside him. Her name was Maggie Johnson. Johnson met Eastwood before the world knew who he was. There were no flashing cameras, no red carpets, and no promise of a legendary career. What she saw instead was a tall, quiet man with ambition and determination. In 1953, they married. At the time, Eastwood was still searching for the opportunity that could change his life. Johnson supported him through those uncertain years, believing in him even when Hollywood had not yet taken notice. That moment finally arrived when Eastwood landed his breakout role in the television series Rawhide. Suddenly, the young actor who had once struggled to find work was becoming a familiar face in American homes. From there, his career expanded even further when he traveled to Italy to star in A Fistful of Dollars, a film that would transform him into an international star. But success often changes the rhythm of a life. As fame grew, the quiet simplicity of Eastwood's early marriage slowly became more complicated. Long filming schedules, international travel, and the temptations of Hollywood began to place distance between the man Clint Eastwood had been and the legend he was becoming. Still, Maggie Johnson would always remain part of the beginning, the woman who believed in him first, and the next woman to enter his life would change everything. Hollywood's most intense love, Sandra Locke. By the mid-1970s, Clint Eastwood was no longer just a rising star. He had become one of the most recognizable faces in cinema. The quiet gunslinger, the fearless lawman, the actor whose presence alone could carry an entire film. But it was during this period that a woman entered his life who would become one of the most talked-about relationships in Hollywood history. Her name was Sandra Locke. The two met while working on the Western film The Outlaw Josie Wales. Locke was already respected as an actress, known for her unique screen presence and emotional depth. Yet few people expected the strong personal connection that would quickly form between her and Eastwood. Their chemistry was obvious. On screen, they appeared natural together. Off-screen, their relationship deepened rapidly. Before long, Locke became not only Eastwood's partner, but also one of the most important collaborators in his professional life. Over the next several years, Locke appeared in multiple Eastwood films, including The Gauntlet and Sudden Impact. The two worked closely together, traveling from film sets to premieres, sharing a partnership that seemed deeply intertwined with both their careers. For many observers, their relationship felt intense, even defining. Hollywood magazines followed their story closely. Fans often viewed them as one of the industry's most powerful creative pairs. But relationships that begin under bright lights often carry hidden pressures. Years passed, careers evolved, and personal differences slowly grew harder to ignore. What had once appeared to be an unbreakable bond eventually faced difficult challenges that neither fame nor success could easily solve. Still, for a long stretch of time, Sandra Locke remained one of the most significant figures in Clint Eastwood's life. And for many who watched their story unfold, it seemed like the kind of love that might last forever. But Clint Eastwood's life was still moving forward, and another chapter of love was quietly waiting to begin. The quiet relationship, Jocelyn Reeves. By the early 1980s, Clint Eastwood had already built the reputation of a Hollywood legend. His films were global hits, his presence on screen unmistakable. Yet behind the cameras, Eastwood's personal life was rarely simple. During this time, a very different kind of relationship quietly entered his world. Her name was Jocelyn Reeves. Unlike many of the women Eastwood had met in Hollywood, Reeves did not come from the film industry. She was a flight attendant whose life existed far away from movie sets, premieres, and studio politics. Perhaps that distance from Hollywood was part of what made their connection possible. Their relationship remained largely private, far removed from the constant attention that surrounded Eastwood's career. There were no major headlines at first, no glamorous red carpet appearances together. Just two people living a quieter chapter of life. During this time, Reeves and Eastwood welcomed two children together, including future actor Scott Eastwood, who would eventually follow in his father's footsteps into Hollywood. Yet even with family ties forming, the relationship itself remained complicated. Eastwood's life was still divided between the demanding world of filmmaking and the quieter spaces where his personal relationships existed. For Reeves, the relationship required navigating a life connected to one of the most famous men in the world while still remaining largely out of the public spotlight. And for Eastwood, it was another example of how love in his life often existed in unexpected forms. Not always loud, not always public, but deeply real in its own way. Sometimes the most meaningful relationships in a person's life happen far from cameras and applause. Still, Clint Eastwood's story with love was far from finished, because the next woman who entered his life would bring a new kind of stability, and for a time, it seemed like the calm he had been searching for. The marriage that brought peace. Dina Ruiz. By the mid-1990s, Clint Eastwood had already lived several lifetimes in Hollywood. He had been the rugged gunslinger of westerns, the relentless detective in crime dramas, and one of the most respected directors in the industry. Yet behind the scenes, his personal life had often been complicated, shaped by relationships that rose and fell with the passing years. Then, in the early 1990s, another woman entered his life. Her name was Dina Ruiz. Ruiz was a television journalist who interviewed Eastwood while covering a story about his work. Unlike many people who had crossed paths with the actor over the years, she approached him not as a Hollywood legend, but simply as a person. Their connection developed naturally. Over time, the two grew closer, and in 1996, they married. For many observers, this relationship seemed different from Eastwood's previous romances. Ruiz brought a sense of calm and normalcy that felt refreshing in the often chaotic world of celebrity. Together, they welcomed a daughter, Morgan Eastwood, creating a family life that appeared stable and grounded. During these years, Eastwood continued directing and starring in films, including the acclaimed Western Unforgiven, which had already solidified his reputation as one of Hollywood's greatest filmmakers. From the outside, it seemed as though Clint Eastwood had finally found a peaceful balance between career and personal life. But even the calmest chapters can slowly change. Over time, the marriage between Eastwood and Ruiz began to drift in different directions. After many years together, their relationship eventually came to an end, closing another important chapter in Eastwood's life. Still, Dina Ruiz had given Clint something many relationships had not: a sense of quiet stability. And yet, when people look back at the long story of Clint Eastwood's life, they often wonder about something deeper. Because somewhere along the way, there was still one woman whose memory never completely faded. The creative connection, Frances Fisher. By the early 1990s, Clint Eastwood had reached a remarkable moment in his career. After decades as a Hollywood icon, he was no longer just a movie star. He had become something rarer, a filmmaker whose work carried both strength and reflection. It was during this period that another woman entered his life. Her name was Frances Fisher. The two met while working on the Western masterpiece Unforgiven. Fisher was an accomplished actress with a quiet confidence that seemed to match Eastwood's own calm presence. On set, their connection grew naturally, built through long days of filming and shared conversations about storytelling, art, and life. Unlike many Hollywood relationships built around publicity and spectacle, theirs appeared more personal. Friends and colleagues often described the bond between Eastwood and Fisher as thoughtful and genuine. They understood the rhythms of filmmaking, the long hours, the solitude that can come with creative work. During their relationship, they welcomed a daughter together, Francesca Eastwood, adding another important chapter to Eastwood's expanding family. For a time, it seemed as though Fisher and Eastwood had found a comfortable balance between personal life and artistic collaboration. Their connection felt grounded in shared experiences rather than Hollywood glamour. But life in the film industry rarely stands still. As years passed, the relationship slowly moved in different directions. Careers continued, responsibilities changed, and eventually their paths separated. Still, the time they shared left a lasting mark on Eastwood's life, a reminder that some relationships are shaped not just by romance, but by the deeper connection of creative understanding. Yet even after this chapter ended, Clint Eastwood's journey with love was not quite complete, because in the later years of his life, a quieter companionship would appear, one that arrived far from the bright lights of Hollywood. His later life companion, Christina Sandera. By the time Clint Eastwood reached his later years, he had already lived through decades of extraordinary success. The films, the awards, the global recognition, all of it had become part of a career that spanned generations. But as life slows down, priorities often begin to change. The excitement of premieres and film sets gradually gives way to quieter routines, familiar places, and the comfort of simple companionship. It was during this stage of his life that another woman quietly entered Eastwood's world. Her name was Christina Sandera. Sandera was not a Hollywood actress, nor someone who spent her life in front of cameras. She worked at Eastwood's Mission Ranch Hotel in Carmel, California, a place Eastwood had owned for many years and often treated as a peaceful retreat from the demands of the film industry. Their meeting happened in the most ordinary way. Not on a movie set, not at a glamorous premiere, but in the calm surroundings of a place Eastwood loved. Over time, the two formed a relationship that remained largely private. Unlike many of Eastwood's earlier romances, this chapter of his life unfolded far away from the attention of Hollywood gossip. For many observers, Sandera seemed to bring something different into Eastwood's life, a sense of quiet companionship. There were no dramatic headlines, no public spectacle, just the presence of someone who walked beside him during the later years of a remarkable life. Sometimes, the relationships that arrive later in life carry a different meaning. They are less about ambition, less about building a future, and more about sharing the present. Yet even with this calm chapter unfolding, one question still lingered quietly in the minds of those who had followed Clint Eastwood's life for decades. Because among all the women who had entered his story, there was still one name that seemed to echo a little louder than the rest, and remembering that name would bring Eastwood back to one of the most powerful relationships he had ever known. The love he never forgot, Sondra Locke. Looking back across the long and complicated story of Clint Eastwood's life, one relationship continues to stand out more than most. Not because it was the easiest, and not because it ended happily, but because of how deeply it shaped the years they shared together. That woman was Sondra Locke. When Eastwood first met Locke while filming The Outlaw Josie Wales, Few people could have predicted how closely their lives would become connected. At the time, Eastwood was already a major Hollywood star, while Locke had built a respected career as an actress, known for her emotional depth. But their connection grew quickly. Before long, Locke became not only Eastwood's romantic partner, but also one of the most significant collaborators of his career. Over the years, she appeared in several of his films, including The Gauntlet and Sudden Impact. For nearly 14 years, they shared a relationship that blended both personal life and professional creativity. On film sets, at premieres, and behind the scenes, their partnership seemed inseparable. To many observers, it appeared that Locke understood a side of Eastwood that few others ever truly saw. But sometimes the most powerful relationships also carry the deepest wounds. When their relationship finally came to an end in the late 1980s, the separation became one of the most painful chapters in Eastwood's personal life. Legal battles followed, and the story of their breakup filled Hollywood headlines for years. Yet time has a way of changing how people look back on the past. Decades later, when reflecting on the relationships that shaped his life, the story of Sandra Locke still carries a certain weight. Not because it lasted forever, but because some connections leave a mark that never completely disappears. And in the quiet reflections of later years, Clint Eastwood seems to understand something many people eventually learn. The greatest love stories are not always the ones that last the longest. Sometimes, they are simply the ones we never truly forget. What Clint Eastwood learned about love. At 95, Clint Eastwood has lived a life few people could ever imagine. Decades of legendary films, unforgettable characters, and a career that shaped generations of cinema. But when the cameras fade and the applause quiets, even the greatest legends are left with something much simpler. Memories, the people who walked beside them, the love that shaped who they became. Through marriages, relationships, and years that carried both joy and heartbreak, Eastwood's story reminds us of something deeply human. Love doesn't always follow the path we expect. Sometimes it stays, sometimes it fades, and sometimes it becomes a memory that quietly lives with us forever. Because in the end, even a man as legendary as Clint Eastwood is simply someone who lived, loved, and remembered. And perhaps that is the most powerful story of all.